Demacia is a relatively small kingdom to the west of Valoran that values justice, honour and duty above all else. Despite their small size, Demacia has a long history of military success when it comes to defence, using their land's abundant resources to fuel their armies and their fortifications. Demacian culture focuses on self-preservation, so expanding their borders is of little interest to them, and their armies are usually focused on defending themselves and their neighbours rather than conquering enemy nations. Now, I'm going to do this one a little bit differently if that's okay, and focused almost entirely on their history with a bit of a summary at the end, because I think that's the easiest way to understand this kingdom, its characters and its complexities. There's a lot going on with Demacia, and I think this is the best way to give you the information that I think you need. So let's start with the birth of a kingdom. Demacia was founded by a group of refugees fleeing from the destruction of the Rune Wars over 1,000 years ago. Eventually, these refugees stumbled upon a land covered in unusual white trees, which would dampen the magical abilities of anybody nearby, rendering most sorcerers completely unable to cast their spells. Word of this sanctuary from the evils of magic quickly spread, with many migrating to the area over hundreds of years, and eventually in the year 292, a great commander named Orlon united Demacia under a single banner, becoming its king in the process. Now, we don't know too much about Orlon, but we do know that he was revered by his soldiers and eventually his citizens when he did become king. He was a great leader, warrior and weaponsmith, but it's unclear how much of this is true or how much of this might be legend. As Orlon lay on his deathbed, he passed his hammer on to Poppy, explaining that the weapon is intended for the hero of Demacia. Poppy has been seeking out this hero since then, but there's pretty good evidence to suggest that she's the hero herself, she just doesn't realise it yet. Over time, the people of Demacia would learn how to enhance the magic resistance found in the fossilised trees by mixing them with lime and ash to create a new material called petricite, a more versatile product that could be used to construct their buildings, including the royal palace, their walls, and many of their prisons. The more that petricite became embedded in their culture, the rarer that magic became in Demacia, but more on that later. At some point before the founding of the Demacian kingdom in the year 292 by Orlon, a man named Kalam fled from his wife with his twin daughters, Kael and Morgana. His wife had recently become the aspect of justice, and Kalam believed her to be a danger to their children. He found his way to Demacia, where Kael and Morgana grew up in safety. However, when the twins were teenager, a sword of flame struck from the heavens and split in two before them. Each sister took one half of the sword, and both of them ascended into vessels for the aspects of justice, just as their mother had done before them. Kael and Morgana would use their new powers to protect Demacia and its people, but began to grow apart when Kael felt betrayed by Morgana for leaving her alone on the battlefield to protect a group of citizens nearby. Kael would go on to create an order based out of High Silvermere, which would ruthlessly enforce the law of the land, often through execution. Morgana pleaded with Kael to allow her to rehabilitate any wrongdoers who felt genuine remorse for their crimes, rather than simply execute them as Kael preferred to do. Eventually, Kael agreed, but her order did not, and slowly the order of Kael began to resent Morgana and her followers for their more liberal methods. Eventually, one of Kael's disciples, Ronus, tried to imprison Morgana and her followers without Kael's knowledge, and in an act of self-defense, Morgana killed Ronus. Kael felt this death and, in a blind rage, flew into the sky, ready to destroy the city. Morgana flew up to meet her sister and attempted to protect the people below. But as they fought, arcs of light and darkness lashed down at the city below, causing huge amounts of damage. This battle went on for a time, but eventually stopped when Morgana suddenly threw her sword at Kael and flew down to a broken building. She had heard the cries of their father, who had been mortally wounded by some rubble of a fallen building, and had flown down to comfort him as he lay in pain. Kael landed next to her, and they both watched their father die, a victim of their senseless violence. Realizing what they had done, Kael flew to Mount Targon in search of clarity, whilst Morgana decided to reject her divine powers and chain up her wings, after trying to cut them off, which she was unable to do. She now roams the wilderness of Demacia and is known to many as the Veiled One, although they do not know her true identity. The Temple of the Lightbringers was constructed to honour the missing winged protectors and their services to the kingdom, and still stands today as a symbol of Demacian ideals. As mentioned before, Demacia is a land rich in natural resources, which enabled it to grow quickly and carve out a place for itself on the world map. This attracted the attention of many would-be conquerors who would send their armies to Demacia in the hope of annexing it into their own kingdoms. Demacia, however, proved itself incredibly proficient at defending its own territory. A combination of excellent military training and the ability to completely negate enemy sorcerers with their walls of petricite often put Demacia at a huge advantage when defending their lands. Now, it was rare, but Demacia would sometimes need to settle their conflicts abroad and away from the safety of their petricite walls. This left the Demacian armies exposed to magic attacks, and despite being incredibly well trained and strong with the sword, they had little recourse when it came to magical warfare. To solve this issue, a craftsman named Durand was tasked with creating a petricite shield for use in battle. It took 2 years, but Durand eventually unveiled an unexpected masterpiece. A winged statue named Galios, standing 25 meters tall, made entirely out of petricite. This immobile titanic statue would be wheeled across Valoran from battleground to battleground in order to weaken enemy magic users, allowing Demacians to fight their enemies sword to sword with relative safety from the explosive dangers of magic. One of these battlegrounds was in the Green Fang Mountains, where Demacia engaged in a battle with a group of skilled war mages known as the Arcane Fist. This battle went on for 13 straight days, with many Demacian warriors falling to the magical bombardment of their enemies. What remained of the Demacian army huddled around the statue Galios for safety, and as they began to accept their death at the hands of these war mages, that titan began to move. Somehow, the accumulation of magic had given the titan life, and he jumped in front of the decimated army to save them from the magical bombardment of the Arcane Fist. Galios then launched himself up the mountainside and crushed each and every last member of the Arcane Fist, winning the battle for the Demacians in almost an instant. The Demacians began to cheer for Galios, but he returned to his pedestal, becoming a statue once again. The story of Galios coming to life was told back home in the great city of Demacia, but very few, if any at all, believed it to be true, and Galios was returned to his place on the Memorial Road, ready for his next battle. Stories of Galios coming to life and destroying Demacia's enemies would crop up from time to time, but they were never widely believed by the Demacian people, often thought to be a story to boost morale in desperate times, but no more than that. As the centuries rolled on, magic was becoming far less common in the world, and Galios was called to battle less and less. The self-sufficient kingdom of Demacia was now established, strong and tremendously well defended. The kingdom seemed unbeatable, at least until the year 892, when Demacia found itself defending against a much larger empire called Noxus. Noxus had spent the last few centuries marching west, annexing and bringing the numerous kingdoms in central Valoran under their own Noxian banner. They had encountered little resistance over the past few hundred years, but this changed when they marched into the lands neighbouring Demacia. Led by King Jarvan I, Demacia swiftly pushed the Noxians away from their lands and back to the city of Havardis in Noxian territory. Content with simply defending the territory of their neighbours, the Demacians pursued no further and were preparing to head home. News of this defeat reached a bloodthirsty warlord named Sion, who was campaigning in the Argent Mountains nearby, and in response, he marched south to the city of Havardis in order to destroy the Demacian upstarts who had the audacity to stand against the Noxian Empire. Demacia was preparing to return home when Sion charged straight through the Demacian front lines, seeking out their leader, King Jarvan I. Sion expected the Noxian army at Havardis to follow him, but their bodies and spirits were broken, and instead they remained within the walls of Havardis, cowering at the might of the Demacian military. This left Sion and his trusted few surrounded by the Demacian forces, and one by one they all fell. All except for Sion, who, despite being pierced by several swords and crossbow bolts, made it all the way to King Jarvan. After a brutal fight between the two, the king had managed to land a killing blow on Sion, but refused to go down easily. Sion dropped his weapons and clamped his fist around the king's neck, choking him as the king's soldiers stabbed Sion from all sides. Both Sion and King Jarvan I died in this battle. Devastated by the death of their leader, Demacia retreated back to their borders, allowing Sion's body to be recovered by Noxian soldiers. His corpse was carried back to the capital city of Noxus and was buried beneath a monument intended to honour his achievements. There is more story to Sion, and you can find that out in the Noxus video that I've already done. Presumably led by King Jarvan II, Demacia went on the offensive and over roughly 50 years freed most of Central Valoran from Noxian control, pushing them back towards their capital. Instead of claiming Central Valoran for their own, Demacia returned these nations to their respective peoples and sparked up alliances with these countries. Noxus and Demacia have engaged in skirmishes ever since, mostly down by the Argent Mountains, which is where our next story takes place. Many years later, a Noxian arena fighter named Viscero was conscripted into the Noxian military and sent west to fight the Demacians at Kaustad, a coastal nation in the south of Valoran. The Noxians were defeated, with many being imprisoned, and during an interrogation, the Demacians learned that Viscero's real name is Jing Zhao, and that he had been forced to fight in the arena after being abducted near his home of Rykon in Ionia. Jing Zhao's reputation in the arena had reached as far as Demacia, and following a brief but tense interaction with both King Jarvan III and Tiana Crown Guard, Jing Zhao was not only freed from Noxus, but became Jarvan III's personal bodyguard. Now, I'm not 100% sure when this occurs, but we do know that Borom Darkwill is still Emperor during this time, and that Jarvan IV, who we know from League of Legends, is still a child during these events. So my best guess is that this was a few years before Noxus first invaded Ionia, which I cover in my Noxus and Ionia videos. Around the year 991, magic had become much more rare in the world than it once was, and with most of Central Valoran being allied with Demacia in some way, the need to wheel Galio out to battle wasn't all too common anymore. Stories of Galio coming to life had all but faded into myth and legend. That was, at least until a young noble girl named Luxanna attempted to use his power to nullify magic to cure herself of her own affliction. By this time, possessing magic in Demacia was viewed as a crime, and Lux had been struggling to control and hide her powers as she grew older. In a desperate attempt to cure herself, she had journeyed to Galio in the middle of the night and placed her hand on his pedestal. And as she did so, her power surged through him and brought the dormant Galio back to life. Initially terrified, Lux ran from the Colossus, who quickly bound after her, moving for the first time in hundreds of years. Unsurprisingly for a 25-meter tall titan, Galio quickly caught up to Lux, and after discovering that she was a mage, refused to leave her side, as doing so would return him to sleep. Although Lux was touched by these words from Galio, she would still slip away from him a few hours later, deciding to leave Demacia for a new home where magic was accepted. Lux attempted to use her magic to help her escape Demacia, but struggled to do so as most of it had been absorbed by Galio a few hours earlier. She was eventually captured by some men in the Cloudwoods, claiming that she belonged in the Enormant Slums, a place where magic users are exiled to in Demacia when they're found to have magic. Before these men could turn Lux in, Galio arrived and helped her, scaring the men away with his size. Galio convinced Lux that her power wasn't an affliction, but instead a gift and something that she should never lose. He marched home to the Memorial Road with Lux on his shoulder, turning back into a motionless statue. Lux also returned home with a newfound appreciation for her powers and a desire to master it. Around the year 980, Jarvan IV was a child when Jing Zhao joined Demacia. His mother died during childbirth, and he had grown up well groomed and under heavy guard. When Jarvan came of age in the year 989, 9 years later, he was granted the honorary rank of general, and although it wasn't really expected for a prince to take to the field of battle, Jarvan IV did wish to prove himself and launched a campaign into the lands south of the Argent Mountains. These lands had long been contested by Noxus, and were in a somewhat messy state since Sion's death at the hands of Jarvan I around 100 years earlier. Jarvan and his armies won several victories and marched further into Noxian territory, but were eventually cut off by Darius and his newly formed Trifarian Legion, leaving Jarvan and his armies stranded deep in enemy territory. It did not take long before Jarvan and his army was defeated by Noxus, but Jarvan refused to surrender and fled into the forests near Travail. He was hunted down by Noxus and eventually shot by a Noxian arrow, causing him to collapse and drift in and out of consciousness near a fallen tree. Nearby, a purple-skinned woman named Shyvana was also hiding in the forest, although not from Noxians, but from her mother, Eva, an ancient elemental dragon of immense power. Shyvana found Jarvan clinging to life by the base of that fallen tree and decided to help him. She carried Jarvan north to Renwall, an outpost on the edge of Demacian territory, where she learned that the man she had saved was the Prince of Demacia and heir to the throne. The Demacians were initially suspicious of Shyvana, but she had done a great deed by saving their future king, and they made Shyvana feel welcome, so much so that Shyvana's time in Renwall was some of the most peaceful that she had ever known. This peace didn't last long, however, as Eva attacked Renwall. Jarvan, Shyvana, and the Demacian soldiers mounted a defense against Eva, and eventually, through their combined might, killed the elemental dragon. Jarvan offered Shyvana a place in his personal guard, which she accepted, but after some time in Demacia, began to have doubts as she witnessed the kingdom's hatred for magic and felt that people would treat her differently if they knew what she truly was. Whilst Jarvan had made it home, a lord by the name of Barret Bevel had not. He was killed by Noxian mages at the Gates of Morning when Darius led his Trifarian Legion to cut Jarvan off from his reinforcements. Barret had been a close friend and advisor of the king since he was crowned, and had spent many decades dedicating his life to those in need with his wife Lestara. He even housed several child refugees from the Noxian-Ionian War for a time, with one of these children being a young Sona, who they later adopted as their daughter. Barret's death was used by several nobles in Demacia to fuel their own agendas, with Eldred Crownguard in particular, the head of the Mageseeker Order, convincing the king and the council that the blame for Barret's death was not just with the Noxian mages who had killed him, but with all mages across the world, including those that lived in Demacia. In just 3 weeks after Barret's death, Demacia felt like a very different place to be for those with magic. So much so that Lestara fled to Ionia with her adopted daughter Sona in an attempt to keep her safe from what she feared was to come. As the years passed, the Mageseeker Order continued to grow in power, and Demacia had stepped up its efforts to imprison any mage that they deemed to be dangerous. Over time, the bar for what was and wasn't dangerous shifted, and with even the smallest displays of magic being cause enough for exile or imprisonment. One young boy named Silas was handed into the Mageseeker Order by his parents. He was able to sense the magic of others, which the Mageseekers used to accelerate their search for those with magic in the Kingdom of Demacia. He grew up as a tool for the organisation, and whilst he initially believed in the cause, doubts had begun to manifest as he came to understand the realities of what he was helping the Mageseekers to achieve. He eventually turned his powers on his employers when they came after an innocent child hiding away in their family's barn. He could not bring himself to turn an innocent child into the Order and attempted to defend her, and in doing so, Silas awakened a power within himself, absorbing the girl's magic, and while struggling to control it, killed everybody there, including the young girl. Knowing what the Mageseeker Order would do to him, Silas attempted to flee, but in just a few short days, he had become known across the kingdom as the most dangerous mage in Demacia. He was quickly caught and sentenced to life in prison. Roughly 5 years later, Lux, now a young adult, ventures into the Mageseeker compound, desperate to find a way to control and hide her magic. She goes in looking for books to learn from, but instead she finds Silas, who senses her power and offers to help her control it. In exchange, Lux brings him knowledge of the outside world, including any books that he asks for. And eventually, Lux brings Silas a scroll written by the sculptor Durand, the creator of Galios. This scroll reveals to Silas that Petricite does not actually nullify magic as everybody believes, and instead absorbs it for later use. Silas eventually takes Lux's magic and uses it to free himself and his fellow mages imprisoned in the Mageseeker compound. Demacia nobility expect him to flee the city, but he doesn't. Instead, he launches an attack on the palace of Demacia with the goal of killing the king and taking down what he views to be a broken system. This would be a suicide mission, but the palace is constructed from petricite with centuries of absorbed magic in its walls, making Silas immensely powerful. Silas defeats Prince Jarvan IV before making a move for the king, but finds the king already dead. Xingzhao, the king's personal guard, is noticeably absent, but more on that a bit later on. Silas parades Jarvan IV out in front of the palace for a public execution, where Lux and Garen manage to save Jarvan and force Silas and his rebellion to retreat out of the city, journeying north to the Freljord in search of allies and magic that he can use against his Demacian oppressors. He eventually sparks up an alliance with Sejuani and the Winter's Claw tribe, one of the 3 main human tribes in the Freljord, but more on them in another video. The day after King Jarvan III's death, Prince Jarvan IV is torn apart by grief and takes much of his anger out on Xingzhao, who feels guilt for remaining alive whilst his king, the man he swore to protect, lays dead. During a heated sparring session, it comes to light that Xingzhao was away from the king, delivering a letter to the head of the Mageseekers by order of the king. A letter that was never delivered due to the chaos in the streets at the time. Jarvan makes it clear that he does not blame Xingzhao for being absent and asks him to serve as his personal guard, just as he did for his father. Xingzhao accepts this offer and Jarvan asks to see the letter from his dead father. Jarvan reads it, crushes it, and informs Xingzhao to destroy it, who reluctantly does toss it into the fire. Now, we do not know the detail of this letter, but it was likely an instruction to stop the prosecution of mages. This is based on a few lines of dialogue from King Jarvan III, stating that they had gone too far in their mistreatment of mages and created this enemy themselves. Prince Jarvan blames Silas for the death of the king, and along with the rest of the Demacian ruling council, give the Mageseekers more power to find and imprison all magic users in the kingdom, even those with trace amounts of magic that pose no real threat to anyone. We see in the Turmoil short story that the dogmatic approach of the Mageseekers has gone too far, and even those without magic are now siding with Silas to fight for the freedom of their family and their friends. We also see a battle play out in the League of Legends Warrior cinematic from 2020 that shows Lux fighting alongside the Demacians against Silas and his allies, the Winter's Claw tribe that I mentioned earlier. We know from Riot that these cinematics are canon, but the events shown may be from the past or the future, so it's not clear how that Mage Rebellion is going right now. The fan wiki says that this would have taken place in the year 997, but I can't find a source for that myself. This would place the cinematic in the current year of Runeterra, so despite that cinematic being a few year olds for us as players and viewers, it might have only been last month for Lux and Garen. And the absolute latest information that we have comes from the Legends of Runeterra card game, with several new Demacian cards coming out as a part of the Beyond the Bandlewood set. These new cards show that several Petricite titans similar to Galios have been created by what seem to be a family of sculptures who may well be descendants of Durand. I think they are, I'm not quite sure. As a piece of speculation, it might be that many of the secrets previously kept hidden in the Mageseeker compound have been exposed, and that's how the secret of creating Galios has come out. But again, we don't know for sure. And that's it for this video. There's so many good stories in Demacia that I had to leave out because many of the characters in Demacia have a lot going on, and I just wanted to try and pull kind of out the main parts that relate directly to the nation of Demacia itself. There's a ton of good stuff, and it's really hard to decide what should and shouldn't be in these videos, but hopefully this has been enough to get you excited about Demacia, and maybe one day I can delve into some of the other stories in more detail. Stuff like Quinn's story, or what happens with Sona after she goes back to Ionia, or Cyphria Cloudfield's story perhaps, Garen and Katarina, right? Maybe a bit more on Durand. There's a ton of stuff to talk about, but we'll have to save that for another time. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.